So we have a little bit before Tiamat releases over here on the JP version of the game. We're still going to be waiting a few weeks for Golden Week, which is apparently when she's slated to come out, but I thought it would be a very fun exercise to look at some of the other FGO arcade servants and see if we could try to pinpoint what Tiamat's kit is going to be in FGO based on some of those other FGO arcade releases. And before anybody says, well, isn't that a different game? Aren't those servants going to be different? Can we really use that to find out some things that Tiamat may have? And actually, you'd be surprised to find out that yes, we can. If you look at someone like, say, Lady Avalon, her first skill here and Proto Merlin's first skill are very, very identical, right? They pretty much got like the big crit damage, and instead of the Buster buff, she has the Arts buff, because obviously they were like, we don't need two Merlins running around, let's make her like an Arts Merlin. And then for the mobile version of the game, they also tacked on this max HP thing here, because it seems as though they value different things in arcade, because arcade is a real-time game like Genshin Impact or Arc Knights, Princess Connect, games like that where you don't have turns, you have timed buffs, right? So you might notice that values here and there are a little bit different, or they may be a little bit higher in FGO, and that's just because, again, we go by turns, they go by seconds, so they might have to balance things a little bit differently. For instance, you can't really have like an NP per turn skill be super crazy. Like, you can't be like, yeah, just give him like 20% NP every single turn and then translate that 1-to-1 to arcade, because then you'd be getting like 20% NP every like 1 to 5 seconds for 30 seconds, and that's really broken in those types of games. If you've ever played any of those real-time games, a buff like that sounds absolutely nutty. But then you look at their second skill, right? Aside from adding on this little overcharge thing here on Lady Avalon, and then obviously buffing up the NP gauge to 20% instead of 10%, because they also seem to be a little bit more reserved on the battery skills and everything over here on arcade, because again, it might be a little bit more broken in that game if they just let you have like 20% batteries instead of 10%, for instance. So, but you can see that it's very similar. They're basically doing the same thing. Third skill, funny enough, is also really similar. You have the party invincibility, but then you also have the weird thing that both of them are able to like suck the enemy's NP, right? Like, they both have this ability to do so, right? I think it's really interesting that when you look at the arcade servants that released before their mobile game counterparts, that they actually have very similar kits. I mean, even look at their own NPs. They're both basically doing the same thing. They have the heal. Instead of giving the party NP every single turn, she gives NP gain, because again, that might be a little more balanced over there in arcade, might be a little bit easier for them to incorporate. And then instead of having like the stars per turn, she does the like mana recovery, which I'm not exactly sure what that is in arcade, but again, they're basically doing very similar things. And then even Da Vinci Rider, right? Because Da Vinci Rider released on the arcade version before we got the 5-star version, the limited 5-star. She released as a free-to-play servant, but despite that, they have very, very similar kits. Their skill 1s and skill 2s are nearly identical. The only weird thing is that if you look at the arcade version of Da Vinci, she's some kind of like weird debuff buster lady, right? They obviously changed that for us over here on the mobile version. They were like, okay, instead of doing like this weird buster servant for, you know, the mobile game, let's just make her like a really good looper, slap this on her third skill and make her an art servant instead, then add all this extra stuff over here. But I say all that to say that we can actually probably get a good idea of what things Tiamat's going to have when she releases over here on the mobile version in a few weeks. So if you're ready for this discussion, make sure you leave a like on the video and you subscribe to the channel for that daily FGO content and sometimes random speculation videos like this when I just feel like talking about FGO, because who doesn't like talking about FGO? I absolutely love it. So let's start diving into this. So one of the things that I've noticed when I looked at Tiamat's kit over on the arcade version of the game is that she does seem to be kind of a debuff support type servant. It's very, very weird. She, spoiler alert, does have a Buster AoE NP, but I think that is something that they may or may not change, and I have some ideas of what they could actually do with that. But if you look at some of her skills, this initially might seem like really bad to some people. They might be like, oh, it's not like any offensive buffs or anything, but if you actually read what it does, it's not like the critical attack down that she's doing. She's sealing the ability for enemies to actually crit. Like, she actually might have the ability to be like, you know what? No, you're not allowed to crit for 3 turns, 5 turns, whatever they want to slap on that. And that would actually be really interesting, because right now all we have is like critical attack defense and the ability to lower the percentage of the enemy to do critical attacks, but she might be able to straight up just say, you're not allowed to do that. Heal block might not be as big of a deal, because I don't think healing in the mobile game is as prevalent as it is in, say, maybe some of the bosses for FGO Arcade or maybe for like the boss that I'm trying not to spoil what Tiamat came out with on arcade in case they incorporate that in some way in the mobile game, but the boss that she was fighting at the time may or may not have had like some healing gimmick, and so maybe it was just specifically relevant for that fight. In like the same way that like when Merlin released, there was like this huge fight with Goetia, who was like a really chunky boss, and so they're like, let's give them a servant that has a lot of sustain, right? I definitely think this right here is very interesting. I'm hoping something like this would be replaced, and then they'd chalk on like a couple of extra effects. Like maybe she could like lower enemy defense or give the party like an attack buff or something along those lines. Like maybe see all the enemy's critical attacks and then massively buff the crit damage of everybody in our party, right? Stuff like that could be really crazy, but I think it's interesting that she could bring in a new mechanic like that. And similarly, her second skill over here is just like a big stun. Now, I'm not exactly sure what 4 seconds equates to turn-wise in FGO. I'm assuming it's just going to be 1 turn. That still seems really good that you just have an AoE stun. Hopefully it'd be something that's like guaranteed. I don't want any like, yeah, here's like your 100% chance to stun and then you get stopped by like, I don't know, magic resistance or something, right? That could be really good. The curse also intrigues me because usually you guys know I'm not that big of a fan of status like burn, poison, curse. Like I really don't care too much for them. But if you give me a servant that could take advantage of that, then we're kind of talking a little bit. So if they want to add like maybe even a special damage mod for Tiamat attacking cursed people, that could be really good because of those type of damage mods I really like. As much as I like my like man attribute or my earth attribute special damage mods, those are always really good. The ability to be like, oh, slap a debuff on somebody and then just get insane damage has been around since Robin Hood, and it's always been something that I've really liked because it's effectively something you can use against anybody, right? It's free damage on anyone you can land the debuff on, so maybe Tiamat also gets like a special type of debuff, right? Maybe it's like a super curse where it bypasses like debuff immunity or something, right? That would be really crazy. I've been waiting for us to get a servant that would actually do that because there's a lot of bosses in the game that you'll fight that'll just give themselves flat debuff immunity. You can't get them, but what if she was the first one that could just bypass that entirely? Like she could bypass one of the boss mechanics, right? I think that could be really cool if she could bypass immunities. But yeah, I think this is a very interesting skill depending on where they want to take it. I'm more interested in like the ability to completely like seal off the critical attack chance, and then hopefully like she could just have some really good debuffs, and that could be really interesting. And then her third skill is like a support. That's why I said that she's a weird debuff DPS support type servant. Like if you look at her in arcade, she kind of does everything, which is why I think she's going to be really insane when she comes to the mobile version, because they have her do everything in arcade. So I feel like she's going to be one of those servants that just does a lot when she comes over to NA, right? Because again, they buff all of the skills when they bring them over to the mobile game, and this is just big HP recovery. And then I know this battery doesn't seem like a whole lot, but they will definitely buff that up. I mean, even just look at like a Proto Merlin, right, who had like a 10%, or where is it? There it is. She had a 10% battery on her charisma, and they buffed that up to a 20% here. I mean, not as crazy, but also it's because Lady Avalon in particular can get to like 100% of her NP from the first turn with that. So it's a little bit different in her case. I'm expecting them to buff this up by quite a bit, at least 20%. If it could be 30%, that would be nuts. But then we go to our NP. Again, NP, this is where I think you get really, really interesting with things, right? Yeah, she removes her own debuffs, right? And then, you know, she blasts the enemy with like a buster buff and, you know, apparently does a lot of damage, right? Blah, 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 blah. What I think would be really interesting is we haven't really gotten someone that can mess around with their NP in quite a while, right? Space Ishtar and Melusine have been like the last two servants that have really had any ability to interact with their NP and change it up in any capacity. So I'm really hoping that if they wanted to be real cheeky, they could be like, yeah, we're going to give you guys another AoE servant, but we're also going to give you someone who can change their NP, and we're like, maybe she could change it to like a support or like a debuff type NP. Like it's an arts thing that hits him with like a billion debuffs, or it's like something along the lines of even like Van Gogh's NP. Because you guys have heard me say that I think Van Gogh is one of the best NPs in the game. It's just so absolutely absurdly broken. So crazy. If we could get something like that on Tiamat, maybe even make it a little bit more general, because at least Van Gogh, if you want to get it to real nutty levels, you got to be using its like threats against humanity, right? You got to like use those guys on your team. But if they wanted to make it like that but more general, dude, it would go so hard. And plus, who wouldn't be hyped to see another changing NP, right? I don't know if they would have done that on arcade, because Arcade is still like a little bit newer than the mobile game. They might be trying to catch up on being able to do stuff like that. But yeah, I think something along those lines could be really cool, because then you give like the meta people a new really good like Buster AoE servant, so they could use that for farming. Maybe you slap on like 100% battery like Arcade or something in there, right? You just throw that in there so meta people could use it. But if you want to use her in more interesting team comps, you could also crack her out as like this debuff support type lady. That's where I think they might take a little bit of change with her, because honestly, when it comes to releases like Tiamat, you'll notice that anytime they have their like grubby little mitts on a really popular character, they make them really basic, really straightforward, really good, right? Like, I think they did a good job with Arcoid. I think they did a really good job with like Muramasa. I think they did a really good job with Rasputin. Like, all of the servants that people are like, man, I can't wait for this guy to come out. Like, even Tomamovich, right? They just make them really good. They just make them very, very solid. They don't usually take a lot of risks with them. They just make them real good. So like, even if you don't think that like, oh, well, if Tiamat's going to be this like debuffing lady, I don't know if I'm going to really like that. Trust me, she'll be really good. I don't think they can really botch a release like Tiamat like this. Like, I think they're going to like purposefully make this servant really, really good, because they know a lot of people have been looking forward to the servant. And if they do botch it up, then I have no idea what they're doing, because it's like, you literally have the blueprint for like what good servants could look like. Look at every one of the other like really popular releases and just copy paste that, like at the very least. If you're not going to do some interesting like debuffy servant that it kind of looks like she's going to be able to do with like these, and that also like supports people and can also do damage, if you're not going to like try to like balance all of that out and make her just a really nutty lady, just like copy and paste like Arjuna Alter or something, right? Just copy and paste Arcoid, just copy and paste some other servant, right? Like, because at that point, I'd rather have a copy paste than have a really hype release be really mid. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think that we might see like a debuff support lady Tiamat? Do you think they might change her entirely and just make her a huge offensive nuking lady? Regardless, I think she'll be really solid. I want to put any of those concerns to bed, but you know, we'll have to see here in a couple of weeks. But with all that being said, I will catch you guys in the next video. Peace, late guys.